Good morning. Welcome to the panel on disciplinary boundaries. My name is Bill Eady, and I am from San Diego State University. Glad you're here. The panel's being recorded, and we do wish to have interaction. So when there is opportunity for asking questions or making comments, we'd appreciate it if you go to the mic, which is in the center of the room. We have a very distinguished panel today. They are all people who have worked in interdisciplinary settings or been trained in other disciplines. And what we're going to talk about is the idea of what are the current boundaries between communication and other disciplines, and how have those boundaries changed? And I will be introducing each of the panelists as we go, and then they will be coming up and giving short presentations, and then we hope to have quite a bit of time for questions. So let me start. Vanessa Beasley, University of Texas, is who received her PhD from the University of Texas, is Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Vanderbilt University, where she's also Director of the Program in American Studies. She studies the cultural functions of U.S. presidential rhetoric. Her research has asked, among other things, how U.S. presidents have defined national identity, how they have responded to crises and other changes within the citizenry due to immigration and changing suffrage laws, and most recently, how they have narrated public memories of the civil rights era. She is currently the editor of the Presidential Rhetoric series at Texas A&M University Press, and the title of her presentation is Things to Declare: Observations from a Border Crosser.
Thank you, Bill. Can everybody hear me? Great. I'm delighted to be here today. As Bill mentioned, I am serving in the capacity at the moment as the director of an interdisciplinary center on our campus, the Program in American Studies. And so from the standpoint of a scholar as well as an administrator, having this opportunity today was wonderful to think about some of the lessons. I've also been fortunate enough to increasingly receive invitations from universities in distant lands and travel, therefore, internationally to talk about communication. Over the last 6 months, I've given 5 lectures in China, Belfast, and then last week, Milan, Italy, all invited by non-rhetoric departments to talk about my research. And so with that in mind, and with some awareness of what it's like to go through customs at this moment, if you'll pardon the cuteness or too cuteness of this, I have organized my 5 observations around the metaphor of border crossing, thinking about those moments in the airport when you're arriving and you're tired and there's some places to go to get your passport stamped. So things to declare, as Bill said. And the other disclaimer I'll say is I'm going to use stereotypes that are going to offend everybody across the board. So it's not just you I'll be offending, it'll be everybody. Observation number 1 from a border crosser. The boundaries are real. They are policed by both customs and agents. In my experience, those of us who are trained in communication studies generally, and rhetoric specifically, tend to read widely and think ecumenically, especially when it comes to methods. Likewise, within rhetorical studies, some of us tend to think of our expertise more in terms of an object of study than our methodology. In fact, we have and will continue to have robust debates within our own discipline about the nature and limits of what constitutes our methodology. And these debates and fights amongst ourselves are largely internal. So when we go outside to another land, we often think about claiming our primary expertise within or around our critical object, such as, in my case, the presidency. And we try to talk to other people who share an interest in our critical object. And in my case, at the beginning of my career in particular, this was primarily political scientist. But in recent years, it's developed into more of a conversation also with historians and cultural anthropologists. And it comes as a shock, especially those first times you travel into these other lands, that people want to talk about your methodology sometimes way more than they want to talk about your critical object. Now, there are good reasons for this. They sometimes can't understand why you think what you think about your critical object if they don't understand your methodology. And I'm sure many of you have had the same experience I have. They do not understand our methodology. And in fact, the more seriously they take your idea or your argument, in my experience, about your critical object, the more questions they're going to raise about how you got that idea or argument. It can be very, very difficult for social scientists in particular to separate the two. That is, they may think your finding is interesting, but they may not value it if they don't understand how you arrived. And so my larger point here is that it is a fundamental mistake for us to underestimate the methodological divide, and perhaps more importantly, the epistemic differences at its root. What counts for knowledge is not just different because we count things differently. It is different because our basic ideas about the functions, nature, and limits of that knowledge can be different. I'm not interested in predicting an election's outcome, for example. I'm glad other people have models to do that, and during election season, I look at those websites just like everybody else. But that's not my question. I'm more interested in the cultural work that presidential rhetoric does, as opposed to the more instrumental nature of this discourse during campaign season. And I've learned in my border crossing experience to stop trying to make my ideas or my questions or even my arguments pass as something that they're not, to claim where my interests lie and to claim what my argument is on its own right, not to try to translate it into somebody else's terms. I still explain my assumptions and my methods, to be sure, but I no longer think that if I just find the right words, I'll somehow persuade them that my methodology is as accurate as theirs. I can't. What I've come to believe is, at that border crossing, the best thing I can do is make the agents scratch their heads and think, wow, she's on to something interesting, even if I don't quite understand how she got there. That's a success. That's a way to get across the border. That's a good day at the office. Number 2, if you know somebody, you can usually find your way in. Pedigree matters. People know this before they go to graduate school, of course, and they really know it after they graduate. It matters within our disciplines, but it really, really matters in interdisciplinary spaces, at those borders, when the program or advisor's name does not just indicate the presumed nature of your training within your own field generally, but also can signal the accessibility, relevance, and even the friendliness of your own research to people outside of your field. This signal matters for 2 reasons. First, and in really instrumental terms, I'm personally aware that I've been invited into multiple conversations, conferences, and even a political science volume or 2 because of who my advisor was. Once I got there, I had to earn my keep, and I'll let others be the judge of how well I did that. But he, and I was tempted, he who shall not be named, he, my advisor, Rod Hart, was the one who opened the door. He didn't open the door because he did anything. He opened the door because people trusted that if I studied with him, it would account for an understanding of how different fields operate methodologically and argumentatively. But second, the second reason why pedigree matters, and this is more important to me, is the more intellectual reason. Working with my advisor meant that I had to learn to be fearless. I was taught to be fearless about engaging with different questions and conversations. I learned that because it's what he did. And it was just what I wanted to do. In fact, I didn't have a sense that there were other alternatives until after I graduated. I didn't know that that kind of fearlessness would have costs, and it has. But I also knew intuitively at the very earliest stage that that kind of fearlessness was the ticket through which I would continue to travel, and it's benefited me greatly. Number 3, things will go well and probably easier if you travel light. By this, I mean that being an interdisciplinary scholar in the best days means focusing on ideas. Being an interdisciplinary scholar means that other people outside your discipline aren't interested in the critical genealogy, the gossip, or the rumors about what's going on in your field. And I think actually this means some of the conversations you have with your interdisciplinary partners can be noble in ways that they aren't perhaps as noble at home. Around the Thanksgiving table, for example. They can be idea-centric. But you have to make that determination to travel light. And any of you who have traveled recently or are getting ready to travel to go back home know that this is a hard choice. You have to be very strategic and, in fact, thoughtful about what you choose to take with you. And this third point is just to get the idea across that what we have to consider when we're being interdisciplinary representatives and conversational partners is the focus on the ideas stands apart from, sometimes rightly and wrongly, the people who created those ideas. And again, that's a double-edged sword. On the plus side, it keeps us away from reinscribing some of the politics within our own field. On the negative side, it may mean that we're not always able to communicate our own histories and our own missed opportunities very well to other audiences. Number 4, once you get to your destination, you might start to miss home. Or you might start to think about what it is that makes home so important. As all travelers know, the journey is the important thing. Maybe it's even exhilarating because it forces us to step outside of our comfort zone. The first thing that happens when you're uncomfortable is that you start to think about your own comfort. You learn what you've taken for granted at home as well as your preferences, especially those things that you have to have while you're traveling and those things you can more easily let go of. It's been my experience that this is true intellectually to the extent that when you talk to scholars from other disciplines, you realize where your commitments are, and you realize I'm committed, you're committed, to not just doing a version of bad political science or poor cultural anthropology, but doing the best version of good communication studies and rhetorical scholarship that you can muster. When my friend, the cultural anthropologist, and I speak about our work, we agree strongly about the role and centrality of language and symbolism. He's always giving me ideas of people I should read outside my field. But my object of study is always going to be that language itself, whereas he tends to think that that language is a way in to his object of study, rituals, relationships, the maintenance of hierarchy. And that difference is pretty monumental. And as much as I said earlier that it helps if we travel light and go with our ideas, this fourth point is where I want to underscore it's also important that we remain true to our own discipline, that we remain true to what makes us distinctive and have the ability to articulate that we can say why we love coming home. And last, number 5. Sometimes when you go through these border crossings, you'll travel alone, and that's okay. Being interdisciplinary is harder than it looks, and that's something we should talk about, especially in forums like this. Someone told me recently that being interdisciplinary means that at least one of your conversational partners at all times will assume that you do not know what you are talking about. And you have to get comfortable with that. You have to also think about your job as a translator, to go back to the travel metaphor. Your job at that point is first to figure out how to keep that conversation going anyway, and second, and I think this is important, how you can take that suspicion or mistrust and turn it into an opportunity for you to learn from that person. You really have to be a good listener at that point, taking what you can from his or her questions without losing your own footing. I think that these kinds of travels have helped me stay intellectually open and curious, but also secure in what I know and what our field represents, and more importantly, courageous, happy to travel again, happy to say yes to the next invitation. That's, as I mentioned, what was modeled for me, and that's what I still try to model for others. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Daniel Linz received his PhD in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research involves empirically testing the social psychological assumptions made by the law and legal actors in the area of the First Amendment and freedom of speech. His research spans the topics of media violence, pornography, and other sex-oriented entertainment, pretrial publicity, news and race, censorship, and online privacy. His work on media and its effects on human behavior have been cited extensively and relied on by government and educational institutions. And the title of Dan's presentation is "Disciplines Are Dead, Processes Are Alive."
Well, thank you, and I'm going to depart from the notion of a distinguished panel of scholars and make my presentation. which I don't think will be very distinguished nor very scholarly, but just a set of observations in a form that might involve this pithy little statement that disciplines are dead and human processes are alive. And I'll limit my remarks to my experience at UCSB, because we are in communication at UCSB and UCSB generally, a very interdisciplinary organization and a very interdisciplinary, certainly, department in communication. And this enterprise of being interdisciplinary, I think, was initiated when we named ourselves as communication and not communications, and not the Department of either rhetoric and communication or journalism or mass media or any other form or thing that is not the process of communication. And so, I'll just, if I make an argument at all here, it's that that the enterprise that we're engaged in, the interdisciplinary enterprise that we're engaged in, was thought about long ago in naming ourselves, but that we have certain boundaries, and those boundaries actually are based on, as the previous speaker, I think, pointed out, on methods and types of inquiry, and what constitutes a empirical or an epistemological inquiry that is acceptable to us and can be a basis of vocabulary among us. But that it's always necessary to kind of oil the machine. That is to say, we have to function as a department in order to have visibility at the university. But at our university, functioning as a department only works to the extent that you can demonstrate that you have cross-collaboration with other so-called disciplines. So I started with the notion that disciplines are dead, processes are alive. I looked to the first definition, at the second definition of a discipline, and that is the very notion of a discipline or disciplining is antithetical to intellectual progress and freedom, I'll maintain. And in fact, if you look at the first definition, it's the practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. And I think that unfortunately, then becomes reified in the process of being a discipline in the academic environment. And I've recently been reading the book The Innovators by Walter Isaacson, which is a story of, among many things, but the creation of the computer and computing science. And he tells stories about Bell Labs, for example, and the collection of nearly crazy independent thinkers who were all forced into the same environment. And there was only one requirement, and that is that they have daily contact with one another. And as a result of that, then there was there's the birth of the computer, and then ultimately of computing science, and then the revolution of information, ultimately in our society, in Western society generally. So the belief then, our belief is that communication is a human process, that the notion of a discipline is dead, the process, however, is much alive. But this name has been important to us, I think, over the years, or just recently I've been thinking about Elizabeth Warren, who is a senator from Massachusetts, and who has just been given the title of Strategic Policy Advisor to the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. And I think it might be the first Senate position, and this is apparently a very prominent position, where the title communication is in the title. And that gives then, I think, us and the notion of communication as a process that must infuse all human activity, a kind of legitimacy. As a department, I think that we liberated ourselves when we realized that the communication is not a place, but to find kind of a structured home, but a process to be explored. And so we then avoid all the arguments about who should be in our home and who should not be in our home, and is our home open or our home closed, and did you come in at the right time, and are you late, and should you be disciplined in some way? But this is also encouraged by other departments in UCSB. Psychology, for example, recently renamed itself Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And this is actually something that's happening in psychology, so-called departments across the country. And this is extremely welcoming. I mean, this is a great liberation. Behavior is a process. The brain controls all that we do. And basically, I think what psychologists, or what used to be called a psychologist, is saying now is that you got a brain and you behave, you might be welcome. And you're interested in that, your study might be welcome here. In what we call our department. And we feel, I think, in many ways the same. Psychology opened itself up then to a center, which was the Center for the Study of the Mind, in which all kinds of philosophical and other interesting but scholarship and scholars pass through that interdisciplinary center, including we in communication. So in our department, then, we have a wide range of scholars that study the process of communication and do so in collaboration in a very serious way with other members of the intellectual community at UCSB. This includes brain studies, evolutionary studies, cognitive, social, psychological processes, computer-people integrations, media studies, legal and policy analyses, organizational and management studies, global interactions, race, conflict, communication and health, fundamental processes and emotion, leadership, political communication, criminology, in fact, anything that involves the process of communication across many disciplines. We do this from a strictly political science or political science perspective, a computer science perspective, an engineering perspective, a film studies perspective, in fact. But we do have a boundary. And again, I will reference the previous speaker. We have a relatively hard, in fact, rule. And when you look at any of our job descriptions, when we're attempting in some way to recruit a candidate, we will say that almost any topic of inquiry is acceptable or interesting to us. Kind of generally find sometimes in terms of interpersonal behavior or something to do with media. But we have one rule, and that is that you have to have a strong, what we call social science orientation. And, you know, this rule makes it kind of safe and reasonable and permissible for one kind of inquiry to be undertaken. And we are not particularly open to other forms of inquiry, and I would call that empiricism in its broadest sense, and that what we're interested in is the derivation of testable hypotheses in some way, and that everyone that we work with and everyone that we bring into the department has that kind of social science orientation, so that we have not in any way abandoned measurement or determination and all the problems associated with that kind of orientation. So we are open to any inquiry into the process, but the inquiry is bounded by this kind of determination. And so my colleagues, though, are very smart, and where I might fail to do what is necessary organizationally to promote our enterprise. And, you know, I think that it's a human process. Communication is that must be studied in a variety of ways. They understand that the university has to know us as and respond to us as a department, and even more broadly, the university really cares about us and our stature in a larger discipline. So the extent to which my colleagues who are very successful at this, being presidents of organizations like this one, being members and other participating members of decision-making bodies in organizations like NCA and ICA, it's truly valued by our administration because they really don't care necessarily, our chancellors and deans don't necessarily care what we study, but they really care about important people thinking that what we study is valuable. And so we are very good about oiling that machine, and we're very good, my colleagues I should say are, and thankfully for that, about oiling that machine while at the same time having always to place more than lip service to an ethic that is, I think, very strong at UCSB, which is that our funding, our positions, our existence really is dependent on our collaboration with other elements of the campus and other portions or other intellectual enterprises on campus. And so that tension, of course, always exists. But in summary, I think that we've been successful, and that is measured by, I think, the wonderful and prosperous graduate students that we produced over a relatively short period of time. And we've really only been a graduate program for about 25 years. So thank you very much. And I will pass this on to a distinguished scholar.
Thank you, Dan. Susan Zeske is a professor of communication arts, associate dean for arts and humanities, and associate dean for advancement in the College of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research centers on rhetoric, history, and political culture and how they are influenced by religion, gender, race, and class. An interdisciplinary scholar, Zeske has published numerous articles and book chapters in scholarly venues in the field of history, English, political science, and communication. She is the author of Signatures of Citizenship, Petitioning, Anti-Slavery, and Women's Political Identity. Her most recent publication is Esther's book, A Rhetoric of Writing for Jewish Feminists, forthcoming in Jewish Rhetoric's History, Theory, and Practice. She has won several national awards for her scholarship, including NCA's James Winans Herbert A. Wych-Ellen's Memorial Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Rhetoric and Public Address, the Marie Hochmuth-Nichols Book Award, the Golden Anniversary Monograph Award, the Carl Wallace Memorial Award for Outstanding Young Scholar in Rhetorical Studies, and a research fellowship and visiting professorship in the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard Divinity School. So she is very interdisciplinary, and we welcome Susan Zeske.
Thank you, Bill. And now Dan set it up, so I have to act distinguished. So I'll do my best.
No problem.
Okay, thanks. He's my fellow Badger. So I've titled my paper "Porous Boundaries: The Porous Boundaries of History and Rhetorical History." William Keith and Pat Gerke begin the introduction to their wonderful volume celebrating the NCA centennial entitled A Century of Communication Studies, The Unfinished Conversation, by asking, what is the use of a disciplinary and organizational history? Writing history, they answer, can illuminate the past as well as the present because, as they say, at the end of an era, it becomes possible to understand the assumptions and patterns invisible to those who make history. Writing the history of NCA on its 100th birthday afforded Gerke and Keith the opportunity to, in their words, reflect on who we have been and what we have done, and thus who we are and what we do. This exercise led them to conclude that the central fact of our history is the ambiguity of we. Doing history, conveying historical narratives, then, is a worthwhile activity because doing so establishes memories and shapes them into stories of who we are based on where we have been or what we have done, either individually or collectively. Even those who would argue that dominant historical narratives have denied their very existence, such as transgendered people, non-citizen immigrants, the homeless, or economically disenfranchised, or in the case of interdisciplinary histories, those people who study such groups, are themselves making an argument from history by asserting their absence from it. For many of the same reasons that doing history is worthwhile, doing rhetorical history is worthwhile. Both historians and rhetoricians are concerned with memory, identity, agency, and community fostered by collective memory. Indeed, since the beginning of what we now call the National Communication Association, member scholars have preoccupied themselves with the study of history in relation to speech or discourse or rhetoric. Indeed, for the first generation of rhetorical critics in the 1920s and 1930s, attention to the historical dimensions of discourse was the very feature that distinguished the fledgling field of rhetorical criticism from literary criticism. During the 1940s and 50s, the second generation gave rise to the field of public address, and in his foundational 1947 essay, Public Address, A Study in Social and Intellectual History, Ernest Rege wrote, A speech is an agency of its time, one whose surviving record provides a repository of themes and their elaborations from which we may gain insight into the life of an era as well as into the mind of a man. What followed was a proliferation of public address studies, many of which in their neo-Aristotelian method with its focus on ethos, pathos, and logos, privileged analysis of context over text. The dominance of historical methodology was challenged, if not toppled, during the culture wars of the 1980s and 90s with the arrival of new criticism in European social history. Rhetorical historians rallied, with Stephen Lucas in 1981 sounding the alarm over a, quote, keen sense of schism between history and criticism, which characterized them as conflicting rather than complementing activities. And in 1998, Kathleen Turner, ironically now our NCA president as we celebrate the centennial of the organization, asserted the value of historical approach to the study of communication, arguing that rhetorical history, both as a methodology and as a perspective, offers insights that are central to the study of communication and unavailable in other approaches. At the same time, feminist rhetorical scholars insisted that the canon include women's voices and that public address scholars broaden notions of what they considered to be of historical import to make room for the study of women's discourse. This fueled the shared project of recovery, entailing extensive archival work aimed at recovering primary documents that are artifacts of women's rhetorical activity. Over the last decade, in which the work of rhetorical history has in large measure taken up gender, race, and sexuality, the loci of historical analysis has expanded. The personal history of the critic has become the focus of criticism. For example, Chuck Morris urges the critic to engage in self-portraiture, by which he means looking back on and narrating one's process as critic, contextualizing oneself, and speaking oneself as part of the critical act. Having taken stock of the history of rhetorical history, I will turn to the question I've been asked to address, which is, what are the boundaries between historical scholarship and rhetorical historical scholarship? Ironically, Regi bristled at this very question back in 1947, writing, "Squabbles over contested rights are hangovers from an age of academic primogeniture. A study is to be judged by its merits, not by the writer's union card." And I would essentially say the same thing 70 years later. The boundaries between history and rhetorical history are porous because the methodologies employed in each discipline are neither entirely systematic nor fixed. It is more likely that rhetoricians will do history than historians will do rhetorical criticism, I'll admit, for few historians are trained to approach text rhetorically. They tend to see a speech text or a discursive text as a set of data points rather than as a cohesive unit of expression. And this echoes what Vanessa said about the cultural anthropologist who sees the text as a way into something else, as a way into studying another dynamic rather than considering it per se. Further, historians stand at a remove from the rhetor, critiquing how the individual acted in society, while the rhetorical historian attempts to get inside the head of the rhetor, trying to figure out what he or she is trying to do. History is what historians have the vision to find or what they choose to do, so there are only partial histories, writes Eugene Weber. To my mind, rhetorical history is the critical analysis of discourse to reveal the functions of context and historical elements in the text. Rhetorical history is rhetorical criticism that attends to the context in which discourse is uttered and to the appropriations and intertextualities of the statement uttered. Appropriations and intertextualities are artifacts of the past, of history, embedded in discourse. They provide clues about the past of the individual rhetor, the intellectual, psychological, spiritual work she has done to come into being and belonging in a discursive community with enough confidence to utter her own ideas. Quotations, allusions, repeated metaphors, structural mimesis all provide clues about the worldview she embraces and or is trying to create, including how she views herself and others, how she constructs her audience, her discourse community, by invoking previous utterances as touchstones. Rhetorical historians also attend to narrative, which are the stories about past events. They are of interest to rhetorical historians because they construct worldviews and draw the reader or listener into a world constructed by another human. To hear a speech is to experience a narrative and thus to live vicariously in the world of another human being. And because narratives have protagonists, they have narrative action. With narrative action comes ethical valuation of that action. This is to say that rhetorical history entails an evaluative, critical, or judgmental function. Ultimately, then, to do rhetorical history is to seek to understand how symbols are used to connect individual and collective selves across time and space, and to understand and evaluate the implications of how they discursively assert their being and acting in the world. Thank you.
Steve Fuller is Auguste Comte Professor of Social Epistemology at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Originally trained in history and philosophy of science, Fuller is best known for his foundational work in the field of social epistemology, which is the name of the quarterly journal that he founded in 1987, as well as the first of his more than 20 books. Rhetoric has always been central to his practice and scholarship, especially in terms of his advocacy of interdisciplinarity and the role of the public intellectual. His most recent work focuses on the visions for the future of humanity. Steve's title is the distinction between philosophy and rhetoric still worth drawing today, and if so, how?
First of all, let me thank Bill for inviting me to this. In a way, I feel very much honored to actually address the issue about the relationship between rhetoric and philosophy, because in terms of disciplinary boundary negotiations, this is the oldest and most venerable of them all. And in fact, as you probably know, right, rhetoric was created as kind of a swear word by Plato for those other people who might be confused with philosophers. They were doing something different. And so the othering, the original othering, as it were, is how rhetoric came into being. And so there's a question as to whether this kind of distinction has a kind of positive spin to it, you might say, from the rhetorician's standpoint, especially today. And the way I want to begin my comments is by talking about the sense in which the discipline of philosophy and rhetoric or communication find themselves in similar positions today. Okay? And that has a lot, and this is more of a kind of a sociological observation. And what I would say is that both fields are very much subject to instrumentalization. That is to say, the value that these fields have in terms of the knowledge they produce is primarily in terms of their service capacity, either to other disciplines or to the society at large. But there isn't a great deal of appreciation for the value of these disciplines in terms of the knowledge they themselves produce. Okay, and in the case of philosophy, I think I would point to two trends which I think have analogs in the communication field. The one that I think is a fairly obvious form of instrumentalization is if you look at the job market for philosophy, for example, in terms of where the jobs are, right, very often it's in applied ethics or applied something else, bioethics, biomedical ethics, things of this kind, right? Where in a sense you're basically taking some philosophical concepts into another arena, and basically enhancing the education of other people who are regarded as doing the first order work. And that's pretty obvious. And within the field of philosophy itself, that kind of activity is, you might say, tolerated, but those who go down that route aren't usually very well esteemed as philosophers. On the other hand, equally instrumental, but a form of instrumentalization that actually is valued by philosophers, is when philosophers become conceptual underlaborers to the special sciences. Okay, so you become a philosopher of physics, a philosopher of biology, right? And this was something that in a way really only started to get ahead of steam in the 1980s when I was training as a graduate student, where I was advised as someone who came from a background in the humanities and social sciences that if I wanted to succeed, I should get an MA in some science. I didn't. And I thought it was a bit kind of bad that philosophers had to kind of somehow apologize for their existence, and the only way they can sort of, as it were, show they were worth anything was by actually acquiring credentials in another field and then talking to that field as if one's own field had wasn't sufficient. Okay? Now that's highly valued within the field, let me tell you. Okay? And I think in a sense, the communication field in a way suffers from a similar kind of problem here. In a way, what's the way out of this? Now, you might say one way out of this is for communication to think about itself as a proper discipline with its own canonical body of knowledge that it reproduces for its own sake. I think that might have been a good answer when I was starting my career 25, 30 years ago, but I don't think disciplines have much of a future as the kind of, you might say, ontological basis, ontological substructure of the university as an entity. Right? Universities are actually being divided up in many more different things, because one of the things that's very key about a discipline in the kind of modern university sense of it is that you have people who are teachers and researchers, and there's some sense in which the research one's doing is feeding back into the teaching, and even, and there is that kind of, Wilhelm von Humboldt is usually the point man on this for the modern university, the unification of teaching and research as being what the academic is about. Well, that's being split apart, and when that gets split apart, then the discipline doesn't really matter, okay? And so you're going to have, on the one hand, you'll have people hired for teaching, right, and they will be hired for their ability to deal with client groups of various sorts. And then you'll have people doing research, but the research doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a discipline. In fact, it'll probably be pretty interdisciplinary by nature, right? And you will bring a certain set of skills, methods, as has been mentioned earlier here, and that will be, as it were, your contribution to a large-scale research, probably externally funded to a certain extent, the value of which will be, maybe important, but won't necessarily reflect back on whatever field you came from. Okay? And so it seems to me this is the kind of world we're in now. And so to talk about the value of communication and rhetoric as a disciplinary matter, bounding disciplines and so forth, in the sense that, which we maybe it was reasonable to talk about it in the post-Cold War era, I don't think it's going to apply very much in the future. I think we have to kind of think about the problem a little bit differently. And here is where I think going back to Plato actually does become important, because in a sense we have to say, what was this dispute between philosophy and rhetoric really about at the end of the day? Okay? And the way I interpret this, and of course there's a lot of excellent scholarship in this field about this, but I do think this is in a sense where we need to go back to, is what was Plato's beef with what he called rhetoric, okay? And I think there's several different issues here. One of them that I think is really quite important is that Plato, at the end of the day, did not really believe that you could, that in a sense, the kind of knowledge that we have about how the communication process works, to put it in more modern terms, was something that was fit for mass consumption, right? In other words, there had to be some kind of mediation, right? And in this respect, this is where metaphysics and philosophy and all this kind of high-minded talk comes in that sort of recodes what in fact it takes to understand the nature of reality and to govern society and things of that kind. And what you really couldn't do was to actually bring this knowledge in a very, what might be called vulgarized way to people so they could empower themselves. Okay? Because this is what the sophists were doing. Right? And the way you could see this at that time was the fact they were charging money, and if you were able to pay, they'd give you the knowledge. They didn't look at your character, they didn't look at other kinds of issues, they didn't look at whether you came from the right background or anything like that. If you could pay, they'd teach you the stuff. And so they made a point, as it were, whatever knowledge they had, to make it as widely available as possible if you could, as it were, keep the sophists living. Okay, so there was, and the sophists themselves, as was very clear from the Socratic dialogues, embodied what they taught. So in other words, their best sales pitch was themselves. Gorgias and Protagoras, and people would go around listening, watching them and so forth, be very impressed. And this is what gave Socrates the entree to question whether they knew what they were talking about, because they were in fact very impressive people. Okay, so what I want to say here, and I'm going to wrap up here, is that there is a sense in which if you want to distinguish communication or rhetoric from philosophy, it's not necessarily going to be in terms of content issues, and it won't be in terms, certainly in the future, not in terms of traditional institutional disciplinary boundary distinctions, but it will be, I think, in terms of whether you actually embody and transmit what you know. Because for Plato, there needs to be a kind of distinction, which we often call representationalism, right? What I know and how I represent it to you. Because you might not be prepared to accept it as it really is. And so I have to mediate it in some way, and that's where we get into philosophy and stuff like that. But for the sophists, right, they embodied what they knew, and other people then were attracted to them on the basis of that. And I think that idea of the self-exemplification of the knowledge that you have is really the primary selling point of communication as a field in the future, even in a world where we no longer have disciplines. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Steve. Jerry Phillipson is Professor of Communication Emeritus at the University of Washington and Director of Speech and Debate at Seattle Pacific University. He attended his first convention of this association in 1965 as one of two members of the Speech Association of America's international debate team that then toured the British Isles in 1966. His research specialty is the study of culturally distinctive codes of communication conduct. He is the originator of speech codes theory and a National Communication Association Distinguished Scholar. His paper is titled Boundary Matters Regarding the Communication Discipline and Cultural Communication, Some Historical Particularities.
My apologies for coming late into the room. I went to another room, and when no one arrived, I thought, well, it's either me or I've made a mistake. How did the ethnography of speaking, aka the ethnography of communication, get its start in the communication discipline, in which it has had a robust presence since the 1970s? I approached the question by examining scholarly problems that inspired two ethnography of speaking pioneers to turn to speech in their studies. In 1953, Ethel Albert, a philosopher of science with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, joined Harvard's interdisciplinary project on values in 5 cultures in the American Southwest. She explored there the possibility of discovering indigenous philosophies in cultures without written philosophical treatises. She interviewed Navajo informants selected for their reputation as thoughtful people, recorded their speech, transcribed it, and combed it for evidence of systematic thought that could be glossed as philosophy. 2 years after the Harvard project, Albert went to Burundi, where she continued work on how to discover indigenous unwritten philosophical systems. There she observed conduct across the diverse strata and situations of life, conducted and transcribed informal biographies, collected fables and stories in the Kirundi language, made records of oral performance, and produced a large collection of photographs of local scenes and peoples. Returning to the U.S., Albert was a fellow at Stanford's Institute for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and then, from 1958 to 1966, was a faculty member in the Department of Speech at the University of California, Berkeley, where she taught culture patterns of speech behavior and occasionally classical rhetoric, where she used her knowledge of classical languages to help graduate students through the Greek and Roman treatises. At Berkeley, Albert fell into an interdisciplinary group of scholars, including Del Hymes and John Gumpertz in anthropology, Irving Goffman in sociology, and John Searle in philosophy, who had made speech an important focus of their scholarship, and who talked with each other about it on a regular basis. In this cauldron of talk about talk, Albert finished her American anthropologist paper, Rhetoric, Logic, and Poetics in Burundi, Culture Patterning of Speech Behavior, in 1964. She used the words rhetoric, logic, and poetics heuristically to inquire into whether she could find in Burundi evidence of previously unrecorded thought that fell under these Aristotelian topoi, you might say. The double heuristic of using the Western categories as a starting point for indigenous discovery but at the same time making the categories themselves an object of critique in light of local learnings was a defining feature of her methodology. Applying it to Burundi rhetoric, logic, and poetics, she found that speech, the medium and activity in which she gathered her materials, is defined, organized, and performed in locally distinctive ways, and thus found in speech a new master category for inquiry into a culture's worldview and distinctive social practices. In 1966, the dean of the School of Speech at Northwestern University recruited Albert to a joint appointment there as professor of anthropology and speech. She taught culture patterns of communication and seminars in ethnophilosophy, semiotics, and semantics, a formidable series ranging across multiple disciplines. In 1973, she was appointed chair of the Northwestern Department of Anthropology and severed her connection with the School of Speech. Albert's legacy to philosophy is the idea of ethnophilosophy and a sophisticated plan for bringing it to fruition in a wide-ranging empirical program, a plan never fully realized. For me, her greatest legacy is the Burundi papers turned toward speech. To learn the indigenous philosophy, she had turned to ethnography, to observing and participating in the speech activities of the people she studied. The paper used, foregrounded, and problematized speech. One, it used speech as a medium in which cultural information is elicited, brought forth, and enacted. Two, it foregrounded speech by showing the utility of treating it as one among other of the stock cultural categories or cultural possibilities, along with, say, kinship, religion, language, art, politics, etc., as something to be made an object of ethnography. Three, it problematized speech. First, as something whose existence and properties must be discovered in each local case, and second, as something to be made an object of inquiry in general and in particular cases as a culturally shaped epistemological resource. The second person I turn to, Del Hymes, a linguistic anthropologist, worked at Harvard, Berkeley, Penn, and Virginia in, at one time or another, departments of anthropology, sociology, linguistics, folklore, education, and English. He was a field linguist, an ethnographer, a student of poetics, a close friend and associate of Kenneth Burke, a critic of linguistic hegemonies, and an empirically grounded theorist. His empirical work was devoted to the construction from field materials of the grammars of Native American languages, such as Cathlamet Chinook, and to startling and delightful systematic discoveries of poetic structures in Native American spoken narratives. In 1962, Hymes proposed a turn to speech in his now classic paper, The Ethnography of Speaking, calling for linguists and anthropologists to work on the situations and uses, the patterns and functions of speaking as an activity in its own right. This is a notion of speaking that is itself a figure of speech that could stand in for all of the means of communication in a particular community. And he proposed a working discovery model to guide such work. Hymes' 1962 is a call to study speaking as a mode of human activity that not only embodies a cultural way of life, but also is a distinctively patterned part of the life of any speech community and something to be discovered in the given case, not to be assumed. He proposed that acts of speech in the context of a speech event are the necessary starting points for culturally sensitive studies of contextualized human conduct. Hymes 1962 and Hymes 1972 lay out a systematic program for the doing of such studies and the use of such studies in comparative analysis. Where Albert had used a model loosely inspired by the Aristotelian categories of rhetoric, logic, and poetics for the empirical study of speaking in its cultural context, Hymes 62 built a discovery framework that integrates categories from the functional linguistics of Roman Jakobson, information theory, Burke's pentad, several units of social analysis, including speech community, speech network, Speech Situation and Speech Economy. In 1992, I gave a talk comparing the Hymes 1962 paper to Aristotle's Rhetoric. Hymes was in the audience, and hoping to get a response from the great man, I suggested that when he was writing the 1962 paper, he must have had a copy of the Rhetoric laying on his desk. And after the talk, he came up to me and said that he had. I suspect that he also had a copy of the Poetics sitting there. Hymes' 1962 and 1972 stimulated hundreds of empirical projects in the decades following their publication, most of these projects involving multiple years in another language than English. Projects that spanned dozens of languages and cultures and that enlisted the attention of scholars from anthropology, linguistics, sociology, folklore, education, and communication. You can see a paper by Donald Carbaugh and me in Language and Society in 1986 for an initial compilation of 250 empirical studies reported as responses to the calls Hymes made by 1985, and see Philipson and Kuchu in 2003 for a more recent treatment of the massive response over many decades to the Hymesian call for the empirical study of speech in its cultural context. I now turn to a lesser figure in the history of thought, myself. In 1968, as a graduate student at Northwestern University in the School of Speech, where I had come to study the experimental analysis of communication processes in small groups, I took Albert's course, Culture Patterns of Communication, and shortly after did the initial field work that eventually led to a change in focus in my doctoral program and to a fieldwork study of communication in an urban neighborhood on the near south side of Chicago, notoriously labeled by me as Teamsterville. I did the data analysis and the writing for the dissertation at a desk on which there always sat a copy of Hymes, 1962, Albert, 1964, and from 1970, the first ethnography of speaking published in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Aspects of Quaker Rhetoric by Richard Bauman, a former student of Hymes. And thus, in a small way, was started the establishment of a disciplinary presence for the ethnography of speaking in the discipline most closely aligned to the association whose centennial we now celebrate. Now I get to join the panel.
Thank you, Jerry. Celeste Condit earned her PhD in speech communication from the University of Iowa in 1982. She is an NCA Distinguished Scholar and a Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Georgia. Through a study in a second discipline program and through federally funded grants from NIH and CDC, she has had extensive interdisciplinary interaction with geneticists. Her research in pathos has led her to utilize literatures from psychology, political science, English, anthropology, among others. She has served as co-editor of Women's Studies in Communication and of Critical Studies in Media Communication, and the title of her presentation is Academia is Evolving into Multi-Meta-Disciplinary Fields. Communication got here first.
Well, I hope you found this panel as fascinating as I have, in that the performance of different disciplinary orientations toward the topic of multi or interdisciplinarity really shows a lot of variety and richness out there. So my take on this is to talk about what I think is really an important change in the academy, which is kind of the rise of meta-disciplines. To get there, though, I'm going to join Steve Fuller and go back to Plato. So in 380 BCE, even before there were academic disciplines, Plato depicted the rhetorician Gorgias as claiming for rhetoricians mastery of multidisciplinarity. The character Plato constructed first claimed that even when a physician could not convince a patient to follow a prescribed medical regimen, he, as a rhetorician, often succeeded at doing so. This first health communication scholar then went on to extend the reach of the rhetorician across the breadth of all human knowledge. and I'll quote Jowett's translation here, that if a rhetorician and a physician were to go to any city and there had to argue in the ecclesia or any other assembly as to which of them should be elected state physician, the physician would have no chance. But he, the rhetorician who could speak, would be chosen if he wished. And in a contest with a man of any other profession, the rhetorician, more than any one, would have the power of getting himself chosen, for he can speak more persuasively to the multitude than any of them, and on any subject. Plato, of course, set Gorgias up as an interdisciplinary bully in order to knock down these inflated claims. The excerpt nonetheless demonstrates that from the beginning of Western scholarship, communication scholars recognized that the utility of communication studies was strongly interrelated with other knowledge and skills. Plato, of course, sat at the dawn of the development of academic thought, and hence was really the beginner of disciplinarity itself. And from that time, we've had a couple thousand years of the proliferation of disciplines and their bureaucratization. However, as many of you have probably heard many times, the end of the last millennium was accompanied by an acute recognition that the advantages of disciplinary siloing have come with severe disadvantages as well. And that prompted a widespread call for greater inter, multi, or transdisciplinarity. For those of us in communication studies, however, I believe the problem has not been that we were too siloed, and I think this panel has exemplified that. We are not too disciplined, but rather the problem for us, I think, is that different scholars united under the banner of speech and later communication studies were intensely allied with different sets of disciplines from each other. For example, interpersonal communication scholars followed primarily models, methods, and theories from psychology. On the humanistic side, rhetoricians first valorized history and American studies, then European philosophy and culture studies, and now critical geography seems to be the rising star. Rhetoricians typically have held and still hold each other accountable for knowing a dizzying range of materials from other disciplines, but only those within the humanities. And I want to give you one example. The March 2014 issue of CCCS happened to be on my desk as I was working on this paper, so I flipped through it, and then I amazingly began to count, and I counted only 3 citations in the entire journal to communication studies scholars. In my admittedly quick scan, I saw no citations whatsoever to any journals published by the National Communication Association, the organization that we're attending now. Well, surely this is an extreme case, an outlier. Previous studies of citation patterns indicate that we have a trend toward external orientation. I think we, to use a metaphor as a rhetorician, we tend to be more like spokes on a wheel than a field that's tethered to any central pole. So is that a problem? In an era where every provost, dean, and associate vice president for X, Y, or Z, sorry, Sue, is calling for is calling for interdisciplinarity, doesn't that mean that communication is right where we ought to be? Well, I'd like to have that easy conclusion, but I think it's not quite right. And I'm going to do one hand, other hand. On the one hand, whatever is going on in the rest of the academy, given our own current state, I think we need to take seriously, much more seriously, what is unique about a communication or rhetorical focus. I think there needs to be more attention to the hub of the wheel of communication. I see rhetoricians and communication scholars, for the most part, imitating other disciplines, rather than creatively appropriating them. In that case, I think we are intellectually expendable. We can just hire a bunch of whoever off the street to teach basic public speaking and who needs a communication department. As I've suggested in print, instead of accepting, for example, in interpersonal, the psychologist's vision of the human mind as an isolated source, a perspective that takes communication seriously must grapple with the interaction process. And that often requires developing and revalorizing tools different from the kind of laboratory model that was dominant in much of psychology. In the case of rhetorical studies, scholars seem far too tempted to throw over the side of our Titanic the long-standing rhetorician's question, which I take to be, how can we use what we know about rhetoric to develop better strategies for social governance? And in favor of that, I think, very important question, we seem to be importing geographically inspired practices of mapping the circulation of social discourse, with the occasional vociferous lament about politics thrown in. Indeed, I think the latest trend seems to be throwing over scholarship altogether in favor of simply adopting existing activist strategies. And as some of my very bright graduate students, Emily Winderman, Sally Spalding, and Dustin Greenwald are showing, it's a mistake to assume that the activist strategies that come naturally to us, first to hand, are in fact the best activist strategies, and that rhetorical study doesn't have something more to teach us about how we can do that better. So that's one hand. But there is another hand to worry about. There's an unproductive staleness, I think, in the specific extradisciplinary alliances to which we gravitate. To describe this, I will say that we might be multidisciplinary, but we are not multi-meta-disciplinary. And the meta-disciplines have come to be primarily for, and in a hierarchical order of value among universities, the natural sciences at the top, the arts come next, and then the humanities and the social sciences, two other groups fight it out for the bottom. This meta-disciplinary boundary set has become, I think, at least as salient in the contemporary academy as disciplines. The boundaries set by the meta-disciplines seem to carve up communication studies, and I think that process has hindered our ability to become rich generators of a different kind of thought that is germane and specific to communication. So, for example, interpersonal scholars tend to hew tightly to the social sciences, and I think that's simply too narrow. Interpersonal scholars demonstrably profit when they attend not only to psychology, but also to the humanities and the arts. For example, much of the rich research in health communication on topics such as HIV/AIDS seems resolutely insistent on citing only other social scientists. But the critical insights that informed much of this valuable research arose as frequently from humanists as it did from other social science. So why that resolute citation blindness to those affinities? Similarly, in rhetorical studies, it is absolute anathema to cite a social scientific or natural science source. Trust me, I have had the experience. Including social scientific or natural scientific resources produces scathing reviews repudiating such grounds on the such inclusions on the grounds that you shouldn't treat them as true. You shouldn't give them epistemic privilege. But citations to continental theorists or to the stars of cultural studies or the heroes of Marxist critique receive no such bristling response. They should have epistemic privilege. The reasons, I think, for this metadisciplinary defensiveness run very deep, and I don't want to go do a diagnostic analysis in the limited time we have here. But I do want to insist that such an attitude cuts us off from learning things and creating new perspectives that we would be richer learning and creating and sharing. And given the focus of this panel, I want to emphasize that this discipline has in its history an alternative model of metadisciplinarity. In the modernist era, rhetorical scholars such as Campbell and Blair drew heavily from both literary studies and psychology. Reaching farther back, both Plato's and Aristotle's models of rhetoric were heavily influenced by the developing field of mathematics. Reaching to the left side, Marx was a literalist when he tried to define his study as scientific, and he attended thoughtfully to Newtonian mechanics and what it had to offer human thought about social change processes. So great ideas come not merely from multidisciplinarity, which has wonderful contributions, but from syntheses that are built with awareness across these metadisciplinary boundaries as well. This is to say simply that the best theory is the one that uses all there is to use. Now, when I talk about this, people from any of the metadisciplines raise the serious difficulties involved in being a multi-meta-disciplinary scholar. And since I've lived all of these difficulties, I do not deny that they do limit what any of us can do individually. Nonetheless, it's reasonable to ask that communication scholars should stop disdaining and bristling at such multi-meta-disciplinary work, and to ask that each of us leave openings for the epistemic fruitfulness of all that the Academy has to offer, regardless of whether it hails from the spoke on the communication wheel to which one perceives oneself being personally tethered. And here I just want to say about the difficulties. I think Vanessa missed one of the travel log rules, which is the bigger the treasure you're trying to bring home from your travels, the harder it is to get it through customs. That when you really are learning something new from another discipline and trying to integrate it into our understanding of communication, it's a tremendous amount of work, and all your colleagues will disdain you for it. So it's a real challenge. But nonetheless, if communication is a wheel that of necessity has many spokes, then all of the different meta-disciplines toward which each of these different spokes radiate do have important value. And those people who can integrate them at the hub are not your enemy. They're actually your ally. So with the wheel, moving forward means in some ways remaining the same. Though the titanium flanges of today may not look precisely like the wooden spokes of the classical era, perhaps the principle of multi-meta-disciplinarity that Gorgias and the classical communication scholars embodies is something we might wish to refashion, indeed, but retain.
Thanks to all our panel very much. We do have some time for questions or comments. As we are being recorded, we ask if you do have them to go to the microphone, and if you have, once you get there and are called on to speak, I'd appreciate it if you identify yourself by name and affiliation. But since there is no one at the microphone at the moment, I will start with a question. This was, to me, a wonderful group of papers and presentations, and I'm just so appreciative to all of you for agreeing to do this, and it fulfilled my expectations extremely well. It's interesting that we talk about multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary kinds of things, and that we're starting to valorize those things. But we also lament that people have thought of us as not a discipline. And in fact, John Durham Peters, who is himself an interdisciplinary scholar, asserted we are not a discipline in his Arnold lecture last night. So let me ask you, are there advantages to being a discipline, or should we just give up this whole idea that we are one? Dan, maybe you want to start because, because you're defending that.
Yeah, I would say who cares if we're a discipline or not. The important thing is how you're recognized at your institution. If you have to function like a discipline in order to be recognized and funded, well, then do so. But otherwise, what's interesting about being in a discipline? It's much more interesting to graze freely in the university and see what you can come up with regarding human communication processes. So we always have these debates too. I mean, it's not as if in our department there's not a constant sense whether or not this person is really communication. But it's not so much the discipline of communication, but are they really studying the process of communication as opposed to being infatuated with some element of the brain or some element of the economic system or some element of political science that is not communication. So that always becomes our touchstone. Is it a communication process? And we don't care where they come from or how they do it, with the exception that it be empirical and that there be a social science approach. And that we hold firm.
Thank you, Dan. Somebody else? Steve.
I want to, in responding to your question, I want to pick up on this point that Celeste made, which I thought was very, very perceptive, namely that this is a field that primarily borrows stuff from other fields and doesn't really sell much that people buy outside of it. And I guess the challenge that Celeste was posing was, to redress this issue in a sense of if communication is going to become a proper discipline, to have, as it were, a properly recognized body of scholarship externally. I don't think that's going to happen. Okay? I think the challenge is absolutely right. I don't think it's going to happen, and I think one of the fortunate features about the time in which we live is that disciplines are becoming less salient. And it's because of that kind of indeterminacy in what the future of the structure of the university is that communication may then begin to sort of rethink what it's about. And this is where I think, the business about the public speaking skills. One shouldn't poo-poo that, okay? It seems to me that thinking about the field of communication as something that, as it were, is enhancing the person, and regardless of what specialties of knowledge people might be in, is in fact where maybe the bulk of the future of this field lies, actually. And there is a body of knowledge and so forth, but it seems to me that the best way to transmit it may not be through the normal scholarly channels that are in the Web of Science and Science Citation Index and things of that kind, but rather through the teaching practice, okay? And I think a recovery of that, which I think is very naturally part of the communication tradition about in some way enhancing the person, ought to be the thing that's central. And that can be done without necessarily thinking about oneself
as a discipline. Because what I don't want to see, frankly, and I don't think anyone wants to see, is just endless streams of papers published in journals that nobody read and are in fact referring to people who are in fact, better known in other journals that you would have already have read.
Celeste.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tough issue because what happens in a discipline that's useful is that we train young people to think rigorously. And those training processes have really resolved around the meta-disciplines. And that's why Santa Barbara says, no critical thinkers, just social scientists, because that's how you maintain a rigor. The problem with that then is, and I think this is happening, that there aren't disciplines, there are these meta-disciplines that then focus on historically shifting topics of interest, usually funded by grant organizations, but other, social organizations can have reasons too. And so, you see this in the natural sciences. They're constantly renaming their departments to catch whatever, there's no zoology anymore, right? There's cell biology and, and so there's this constant sense that disciplines, are kind of short-term if they're part of a academic structure and they're going to move on. But the meta-disciplines then stay, and the meta-disciplines are how people are trained. But they're even more rigid than the disciplines were about crossing perspectives. And this crossing of perspectives is actually, I think, very crucial for human thriving and for the university to ultimately make these kinds of contributions, for example, in teaching. And I wasn't saying it's good that we're getting rid of the public speaking mission.
Okay, just to make sure of that.
That was like, that's what's happening and it's bad. No, because I do think that kind of embodied training of a young person to be in relationship to other people is crucial, and especially now that we're doing this all the time. So those are, in fact, places where that's important, but we are losing the ability to have those kinds of intersections because, in fact, we're farming out all of the basic courses to online or unpaid or low-paid people who don't necessarily have to have disciplinary credentials or at least any depth in a discipline. So I think it's a problem that if we're going to lose disciplinarity and we don't want to just replace it with these kind of bigger blocks of methodological, and it's more than methodology, of course, it's that underlying epistemology, because that also has real costs for what the university can do and what civilization gets made like.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to take a position that acknowledges that most of our responses have been with a concern to institutional needs and changes and exigences, but there's also a way in which all of those institutional changes make a difference for individuals that we are training. And a different way of saying this is disciplines don't just exist to get resources for departments, they exist because they create argument fields. In order to get tenure in a discipline, you have to succeed at arguing within the terrain of that set of argument fields. And if you've ever had even one interdisciplinary conversation, you know that this is true because the way, discipline X argues is fundamentally different from discipline Y. So I just want to create the middle space between what the institution needs versus what society needs. It's also about how we talk to each other and how we argue and what counts as a claim, what counts as evidence, and what counts as persuasion.
I'm going to have to leave it there. We are out of time.
Oh.
But thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you to all of you who came. And thank you to all of you who will be watching on the NCA website.